Slavery has been on our planet since time immemorial. Few people know this, but according to the law of the kingdoms that would later unite into the empire of ancient Egypt, the entire population of the state was Pharaoh's property. From the earliest times of the development of civilization, slavery came to the ancient world of the West and, in a more complex form, the eastern part of the globe. It seems to have been suppressed everywhere since the development of the Middle Ages. The Mayans had slaves, but these people did not live long. They were dedicated to future gods. Let's move on in history. The reincarnation of the phenomenon took place in the 18th to 19th centuries. Europeans colonizing the New World, having failed to subdue the native population of Americas, brought Africans as slaves. This is where this story begins. After all, one of these unfortunates was Seca. Fate brought him a lot in his life. So this is the topic of this episode. Who was Seca, where he's from, and how is he remembered to us in history? Welcome to Flip Side of History. Let's continue. What period is his biography connected with? In the first quarter of the 1800s, some states in the New World, more precisely the Americas, finally began to fight the institution of slavery. The governors of the colonies, in the name of the kings, decided to forbid the owners from having and using slaves. But from the first prohibition to the actual discontinuance of slave-holding relations, many more years will pass. The problem, or rather one of them, was that the slave owners were richer than the kings and authorities, and much more powerful than the intelligence that began to protest against the savagery of slavery. But the wealthy bribed so-called justice. As a result, in most of the colonies, and in one that was freed in 1808, it was decided that slavery would remain, but the importation of new slaves from Africa would be banned. That is, the departure from social inequality will take place gradually, with the departure of the already existing free power, their children and their grandchildren. The intelligent circles were not satisfied with this at all. Therefore, there were still moves towards a classless society. The end will be the Civil War in the United States and several similar, smaller events around the Western Hemisphere. The slaves themselves did not sit still either. They, after all, rebelled and ran away. Who is Seca? In this situation, due to prohibition, slave owners began to encourage love relations between slaves in order to acquire as many slaves as possible. You know how. Even if the agricultural business declined, it was possible to trade in human beings. And these sort of trades were expensive. Slave girls began to give birth early. The norm for them was 15 children at least. It's in exchange for freedom. Whoever refused to give birth to such an amount remained a slave. Men were specially selected for such women, tall, strong, with intact white teeth, and no signs of any other deviations or illnesses. And one of them was Seca. He and his fellow sufferers were locked up for weeks with reproductive women in large barracks. These young men were obligated to do only one thing. We don't think there's any necessity to explain what they were doing there. The guards were constantly hurrying. After all, not every single time was giving desired results. 200 children. Seca was dictated to make 200 babies. Just think about this figure. In the past, not all slaves made it from Africa to the Americas alive and well, and here the newborn slaves and their father and mothers were not in danger of being thrown out of a ship, but rather in danger of horrendous treatment as slaves from birth. But worst of all, the unfortunate man about whom we are talking in this episode was not a worker on the plantation where he produced other workers. He was bought elsewhere, as a breeding bull, immediately as a machine for breeding. He was bought in 1828 to the territory of the Portuguese colony of Brazil, more precisely to Hacienda, or slaves holding farm, near São Paulo. What do we actually know about Para's previous life? He was born in the Spanish-speaking colony of Africa. Therefore, during baptism, the local padre gave him the name Roca José Florencio, the Rock of Joseph of Florence. The 18-year-old really looked like a strong rock. The owner realized that by selling it to American plantations, he would get a lot of money. Para was 219 centimeters tall. How it was happening in the barracks. Sessions of the action began at the signal of the owner of the hacienda. Para was carefully watched by a medic hired by the owner. The producing man was kept clean and given the necessary time to rest. and he was fed very often and with a lot of calories, unlike many others. Recall that for many years of such exploitation, Seca became the biological father of 200 or probably more children, and not everyone has survived yet. It's hard to imagine how many of these babies there were at the moment of their birth. Seca also took care of the plantation owner's best horses. His short vacations were those days on which he delivered correspondence between the farm and São Paulo. This is where this aspect should be mentioned. He could have escaped, but why? He would have been caught and punished severely anyway. He obediently returned to the barracks and did what others wanted from him. The cage. In gratitude for his loyalty, the master ordered all the inhabitants of his domain, no matter the gender, to respect Seca. In the end, the manufacturer even received a piece of land with a decent hut. Here, he could plant his own garden and start growing vegetation. And this is what he did when his health began to deteriorate as he reached old age. As early as 1858, he was seriously injured in his leg, and some of his children took care of him. Was he able to communicate with his biological children? It's a riddle. After the abolition of slavery in Brazil. In the 1820s, a colony called Brazil freed itself from slavery within the Portuguese Empire. But it got rid of slave relations within its territory more than 20 years later than the United States, only in 1888. The now free individuals began to search for their purpose in life. But Seca didn't want to look for anything. In fact, he was even before the aforementioned abolition a free inhabitant of the site. It's just that at the age of 78 he became legally free as well. Here he married a woman whom he had really fallen in love with in this time, Palmira. And in his 70s, last 9 children were from this woman. Therefore, with the abolition of slavery, he also became the fully legal and not just the biological father of these babies, both boys and girls. The hut has long been turned into a comfortable homestead. Part of the large farm of the former owner, by this period long dead, became the farm of Seca himself, or more precisely of Roque José Florencio. He himself never mentioned his old slave nickname in the documents. Here, he worked not on the production of children but on the production of panela, a hard and refined cane sugar. Since it was well known since slave-holding times, there were more than enough buyers for the goods. Things were going well, but all of the money earned was spent to feed the entire family. On the eve of his father's death, the eldest son was already about to get married. And if we are talking about the death of Roque José Florencio, we will explain that it overtook him due to plain infection. One morning, he stabbed by a nail on sharp surface and ignored the gangrene developing all over his body. And when he did start to act, he called a traditional African healer for help, and not a doctor. He was recognized as the oldest man in the area. Shortly before his death, he participated in the parade. Today, in our time, thousands of Brazilians consider themselves many times the great-grandchildren of the strong Seca. But the official descendants of this man are only those who descend from Palmira. These 9 children were the ones who told the world about the ancestor. Colossus on thin legs. In passing, what could the nickname of the main character of this episode, Seca, mean? Well, according to the most common version, from Latin and later from Portuguese, it is translated as dry foot, but not in the sense that it's too wet, but in the aspect that it's too narrow. There is incredibly little left to add, our dear viewer. Seca is, in reality, a symbol of the entire dark-skinned half of the Brazilian population, which is not small, and in some towns or cities, it's really big. A hymn of strength and vitality. Thank you for watching our episode. Subscribe to our channel and leave a like. If you liked this episode, do not hesitate and watch our other episodes on Flip Side of History. And for now, see you later.